Hey, this week we are going to continue in our series that we started a few weeks ago. This is our third week in a series called Take the Land. And in this series, what we're doing is we're looking at the Old Testament book of Joshua, and we're just unpacking that and walking through it. And something Brad's been saying, if you haven't been here, something Brad's been saying in this series, as we've looked at Joshua 1, is this. He's been saying, our lives will move in the direction of the promises we believe to be most true. If you've been here, hopefully that sounds familiar. Our lives will move in the direction of the promises we believe to be most true. The idea is there will be things that you and I believe to be true about our lives, about our futures. There will be things that you and I believe wholeheartedly to be true, and whatever those things are, if we believe them, our lives will move in the direction towards them. Which essentially means that you and I will come to points in our life where we hit a crossroads, right? And we'll have to begin to sort through what are the promises I believe, and knowing and owning those promises. That will happen regularly. You will come to this crossroads. And at this crossroads, what you'll find out is there are promises that God has made you and I about our lives on one hand that will take us in one direction. And on the other hand, there are promises that culture and promises that our own desires have put into our head and given us that will take us in another direction. And whatever we believe to be most true, our life goes in that direction. And in Joshua 1, what we've seen is that God has made Israel some promises. That he's made promises for their future. He's made promises that there's land that they're going to take, that they're going to be this great nation. He has promised them some things. And in Joshua 1, just so we're all on the same page, what's happened is Moses has passed away, and Joshua has taken command of Israel as Moses' successor. Joshua's been given his credentials by God to take over for Moses, and here Joshua is taking command of this migrating nation who's been wandering for 40 years. And they're sitting on the banks of the Jordan River looking across to this land that God has promised them. And in Joshua chapter 3, which we're going to get to next week, what we see is that Joshua leads Israel across the Jordan into Jericho, and they take this land that God has promised them for so long. But in the midst of all of this, if you have your Bibles, you can open to Joshua chapter 2. If not, it'll be up on the screen. But in the midst of all of this, what we see from Joshua 1, where Moses passes and Joshua takes command, and Joshua 3, where they move into Jericho, this promised land, there's this fascinating story right in the middle of these two in Joshua chapter 2. And it's this story about two spies and a prostitute named Rahab. And so we're gonna jump in, and we're going to start in verse 1. It says this in Joshua 2, verse 1. And Joshua, the son of Nun, sent two men secretly from Shittim, not to be confused with anything else, as spies, saying, "Go, view the land, especially Jericho." And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. So what's happening here is Joshua is needing some final military intelligence, right? He just wants to be sure before they cross over that he knows what is over there, what's waiting for them. And so he sends these two spies dressed as foreign travelers into Jericho. And he says, "Go and get some intel and come back and tell us." And these two men, they end up going to this prostitute's house, this brothel of sorts. And really, I understand on some level what they're doing, because I think this is really the perfect cover-up for these guys as they go into this brothel, into this prostitute's house. Because the king's men, the authorities of this time, were very used to seeing random men going in and out of this prostitute's house, traveling men, uncommon men going in and out of this prostitute's house. So here are these two spies, and they end up going into there because they needed to remain anonymous. It was important. Their life depended on them just getting lost in the crowd, just being some other guys in the city. And so they go into this. So what we see is these two men need to remain anonymous, these two men of God, strolling into this brothel of sorts. And look at what happens, and we're going to go from verse 2 to 7. It says this, "And when it was told to King Jericho, 'Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land.'" So the king gets word that there are two spies in his land. "Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, 'Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land.' But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, "True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks and flax she had laid in order on her roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut soon after the pursuers had gone out. So the king of Jericho, he gets word that there are these 2 spies who were in his city, in his town. And obviously, if there are spies there, what that tells him is there is someone who's looking to invade. They're getting intel, they want to invade, they want to attack. I need to do something about this. And so this king says, you need to find those spies, go get them, man, find them, and don't let them report back what they've seen. And so what we see is these king's men, they go and they start knocking on doors, and they end up knocking on Rahab's door, and they say, "Where are they?" And she says, "Where who? Where are the men? Where are the spies?" And she says, those men, yeah, they were here, but they left. They left before sundown, before the gate was closed. Now, every night, what would happen is Jericho was a city that was built, had a wall around it, and there was a gate in and out of Jericho. And every night, a little after sundown, the gate would close. And so if you lived in Jericho and you left your town, your city for a little bit, you went outside the gate and you came back at night and the gate was closed, sorry, you're not getting in. They're not letting you in at all. You're sleeping outside of your city for the night. That's just the way it worked. I'm going to institute a law like this with my boys when they get older, right? Locking the doors at 10. You don't come home, go somewhere else. It'll backfire. So Rahab tells the guards, I don't know where they went. They left before sundown, before the gate was closed. But if you go now, get the posse, gather everybody up, you can go catch them. You'll catch up to them. So the king's men, they take off in pursuit after these 2 spies, and the gate is shut behind them. Now, before we go any further in the text, I think it's worth pausing and noting and observing something pretty important that's happening here. Because I think we need to not miss this reality that God has a way of working through very ordinary and very, very unlikely people. God has a way of working through very ordinary and very unlikely people. Personally, I take tremendous encouragement from that fact, right? That God doesn't only depend on the most influential men or women. That God doesn't only depend on the most charismatic or the most well-spoken men and women. That God doesn't depend on the most relevant leader of the time only to get his word or do his work. Speaking today's language, that God doesn't depend on the most hipster leader or pastor, right? He finds ways to use ordinary people, unlikely people, to do his work. Let me illustrate it this way. There are a couple of guys from my past who have had a really profound impact on my life. There's one guy in particular. His name is a guy, Aaron Baltzell. And I say that name and you go, who is that, right? I say this name and you guys don't have any idea who Aaron is. It's not a household name. He's not familiar to you. He's not a big deal in Spokane. Aaron, he lives here. He's grown up here. He's in his late 30s right now. And he's just a normal guy. Okay, Aaron he's actually really old school because Aaron doesn't have social media accounts. He has an email, I think because work forces him to have an email. And he's like that kind of guy, right? Kind of like Phil a little bit. Sorry, Phil. He doesn't have a smartphone. He has one of those dumb phones, and he doesn't have texting on his dumb phone, and that drives me crazy because I'm like, man, I just want to text you. And he's like, sorry, man, you got to call. I'm like, I'll pay. I offered one time to pay for a year of texting for him on his dumb phone. He's like, nope. You got to call me every time. I'm like, you guy, right? The joke I have with Aaron is like, hey, when I want to get a hold of you, just look for the pigeon. It'll be coming, right? Because he's old school. When I was 16 years old, I was a 16-year-old punk. And I found myself at this Young Life camp called Malibu. And I met this guy, Aaron, for the first time. And Aaron just began caring for me and began taking an interest in my life. And he was kind of just there. Right? And there was something about Aaron when I sat back and thought about it that it was cool. Aaron was cool, and I wanted to get to know Aaron. It's like he had Jedi mind tricks over me because I was like, I want to know more about this guy. What's his deal? And so Aaron, he was just around, and over time, we kind of developed a little bit of a friendship. And when we got back from Malibu, this week-long camp, we got back, Aaron was calling and saying, hey, when are your games, when are your sporting events? Can I come? Can I show up? Can I be there? Well, hey, why don't you get your friends together? Let's go hang out. Let's go play baseball. Let's do this. Let's do that. And Aaron was just there. He just kept coming, and he just kept loving this punk. And a little later, when I was 18, Aaron started a Bible study with myself and a couple of my friends. And as I look back, Aaron just began over time to speak truth into my life. Very slowly, just speak truth into my life. Just be there, get in my life, see what's happening, and speak truth. He started this Bible study with my friends and myself, and he had these plans. It was an hour long before school, and I know he had this great plan. He probably did a lot of preparation, and he would show up, and we would derail the whole thing for almost the entire time, all but like 5 minutes. We would talk about sports and girls and whatever we could think of as 18-year-old boys. And then the last 5 minutes were like, okay, Aaron, what do you got? Bring it. What do you got for us? And as I think about it, that was like one of the best Bible studies I was in as a young boy. Right? It was so great for me because he was just in my life, and then he was speaking truth into it. Aaron became a good friend. I lived with Aaron. He was in my wedding, on and on and on. I still am in contact with him. As we've gotten older, I talked with Aaron, and I said, hey, why'd you do that? Why'd you just keep showing up? You know what he told me? I hated you. You drove me crazy, is what he said. But I kept showing up, and I kept coming because God said I need to show up, and I need to love you. I'm in part the man I am today. I get to be up here in front of you today in part because Aaron just kept showing up. He just kept coming. And so I think in the midst of this text, there's a fair question that we need to ask ourselves. And I think the question is this, and this isn't necessarily where we're going with the message, but who's God asking you to love? Not love them to Jesus, not love them so they become a Christian, right? We do that. I'm going to love this person, they're going to follow Jesus. Woo! We do that. But who is God asking you to love? Who has God put in your life that just says, just be there for that person? Because I know there were more charismatic men around during this time of my life. There were more charismatic personalities. There were more knowledgeable men. There were guys who had a larger grasp of theology than Aaron did. There were influential leaders in our city during this time. But you know who impacted me? Aaron did. A guy you never met. Just an ordinary guy, an unlikely guy who just did what Jesus asked him to do. And in Joshua 2, what we see God working through these two anonymous spies. We never know their names, and a prostitute. And if we think about it, the fact that God used Rahab is unbelievable because Rahab was a prostitute, okay, if you haven't got that she was a prostitute. But do you know what it would have been like to be a prostitute 1,000 years ago? I don't either. Just for the record. But my guess is it was no more socially acceptable then than it is today. But this is how she made her living. This is what she did. So Rahab was a prostitute. Rahab was also a woman. There's an old Jewish prayer that went like this: I thank God that I was not born a woman. That's real. That's an old prayer that used to happen. During this time, traditionally speaking, men were superior. And so Rahab was this woman who God used. This was a time that the attitude towards women was much different than today, right? Just for the record, men and women were all created equal. So Rahab was a prostitute. She was a woman. And then finally, Rahab was a Canaanite. The Canaanites were in direct opposition of God. They were outwardly opposing God. And so here is this woman who has so much going against her, yet God uses her. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. I want you to write down, don't let your past dictate your future. Don't let your past dictate your future. Because Rahab could have built an incredibly large portfolio for why God shouldn't, why God wouldn't, and why God could not use her, right? We can see it plain as day. You and I, some of you in this room, you have built a portfolio for why God can't, why God couldn't, why God wouldn't use you. And what I want you to hear this morning is you need to not let your past dictate your future because God has big plans. Let's go back to Joshua 2. Rahab tells the spies, she says, go hide on the roof And then the king's men come, and she sends the king's men out. And then Rahab goes to the roof and begins speaking with these spies. And that's where I want to pick up the story. It's in verse 8. It says this. It says, before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land. I want to pause there for just a second, because this word Lord that she is used, that is written right here in Joshua 2, is pretty unbelievable. Okay, this word Lord isn't like the word Lord that we're used to. It's a word Lord that was very uncommon. Jewish leaders often wouldn't even speak this word in this translation that Rahab is using. It was often just written. And within this text, as they translated it and wrote Joshua 2, the word they chose to represent what Rahab was saying about God was this word Lord, which essentially is the highest name for God. And it literally meant the existing one. And Rahab is saying here to these two spies, I believe that God, the name above all names, the existing one, is giving you this land. See, Rahab had a pretty unbelievable understanding of God in these moments. We'll come back to that. Let's continue. I know that the Lord has given you the land, verse 9, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you and came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted destruction. So Rahab saying, I've heard about what your God has done. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. And there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For, and now she uses an interesting combination of words, the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth below. And what she's saying is, for the Lord your God, for the great existing one, who is the ruler of all. What's happening here is amazing, because now you have this prostitute woman who was not following Jesus. You have this prostitute woman who begins to profess that these men's God is the only God. And she's saying, I believe that your God rules over the Canaanite God. I believe that your God rules over my household God. I believe that your God rules over every other God that has ever lived. And as she sat on the rooftop with these two foreigners, I think there's some things that you and I can pull out of Rahab's faith. Because some of you like me, if you're like me, you like your life to be very neat and tidy, right? You don't like to operate you don't like your security to be shaken. You don't like operating in chaos. You like everything like this. You have your week, you plan out your week, you plan out your meals, you do this, you do that, right? Some of you ladies, I know you're shaking your head. Guys, I know you do the same thing, even though you're not shaking your head, okay? Just for the record. We do this. We like our life to get all neat and tidy and perfect, and this is my plan, and this is how it's going to work, and this is what we're going to do, and this is how everything's going to come together perfect. We like our routine and our stability. And here's Rahab. And she's aware that Jericho is going to be invaded. And she's aware of what God's done in the Red Sea and with the Amorites. And she knows all of these things. And so surely as Rahab sits on this roof with these guys, there's a component of fear that is driving this conversation in Rahab. But in the midst of the fear, Rahab has this openness to the truth. And I think in her openness, Rahab is willing to be surprised by God. Some of us, we're not so willing to be surprised by God. We've worked so hard to get everything in symmetry and perfect calm, zen. We've worked so hard, and we did this and we did that, and everything is just as it should be. And so we're not so comfortable with God showing up in the middle of it and surprising us and shaking up our world. That's the last thing we want. We don't want God to come in and just mess it all up. We work so hard to get it the way we have it. And maybe it's because she was a prostitute and she was looking for a better life. Maybe Rahab was an open-minded person who saw a need for change in her life. Maybe she was a religious person who had gone down some other roads, and finally she has come to something that is worthy and something that is real truth, something that she's never experienced. Maybe it was just these two spies that showed Rahab attention and talked with Rahab and didn't just look to her for her body, and she'd never experienced that before. Or maybe it's just because she knew that their God was a God of new beginnings. You see, we don't know exactly why Rahab responded the way she did. But what happens is Rahab hears of what God has done, and Rahab chooses to participate. Rahab hears of what God is doing, and she chooses to participate in what God's doing. Abandoning her trade was not part of the deal. Changing her life was not initially part of the deal. Right? She acknowledged Israel's God as the most powerful God. She hid the spies, and this was the start of Rahab's faith in Jesus. If you were to open to the book of Hebrews, what you'd see in Hebrews is there's this chapter that lists kind of the Hall of Famers of faith. Rahab is listed in Hebrews as a Hall of Famer of faith. And it started here as she just began to open up to Jesus. And as she did this, you see, Rahab wasn't scared off by God coming in and changing things up. She wasn't scared off by the chaos that could ensue from her, a Canaanite, following Jesus. She wasn't scared off by any of that. Rahab chose to align her life with God. And as she aligned her life with God, she also was choosing to eradicate her life of old gods. What does this mean for you and I? What this means is some of us here this morning, I believe we need to begin to align our lives with God. We've been talking in this series about the land God has for you to take, that God has something for you, that it's there, that He wants to do something big in your life. But some of us, we like the theoretical idea of God. We like the comfort and the security that comes from being a Christian. We like the spiritual and moral comfort we feel and we receive from being a Christ follower. But we're terrified that God's going to show up in our life and He's going to ask us to do something we don't want to do. That we're terrified that God is going to unwelcomely show up in our life and change things all around and flip the script on us. Let me ask it this way. What would happen if God showed up and you heard very clearly, it was like one of those aha moments, that you heard the voice of God, the heavens opened up, the voice of God spoke to you and He said, I want you to move out of Spokane tomorrow. Some of you are like, boom, been waiting for that day. Woo, I'm out of here. But truly, what would you do? You hear very clearly and God says, you're out of Spokane. This is the land I have for you to go somewhere else. How do you respond? Because most of us, albeit we don't say it externally, we don't say it verbally, but most of us say, God, I love you. God, I want to follow you, but God, don't make me do that. God, I love you. God, I want to follow you, but don't make me give that. God, I love you. God, I want to follow you. I want to devote my life to you, but don't ask me to do that. You see, some of us, we need to begin to align our lives with God and actively participate in what He is doing, right? Because He has things, He has plans, He has purpose for you, but you're not going to experience those plans, those purpose, unless you begin to align with Him. Some of us, we need to do that. Others of us, we align pretty well. We're like, yeah, it's fine. God wants to come in and shake my world up. That's cool. I'm out of here. He wants to send me somewhere else. I'm all good with that. But some of us, I think, need to begin to eradicate our life of gods. Said another way, some of us need to begin to eradicate our life of idols. Whether you realize it or not, every one of us in this room, we're worshipers, right? And you're like, duh, bro, we sang some songs a little bit ago, right? But we're worshipers, right? Whether you're a Christian or not, you're a worshiper. Whether you're an atheist, a Buddhist, an agnostic, whatever it is, you are a worshiper. You and I were created to worship. That's how we were created. Everyone who's living is a worshiper, pouring themselves into something or someone. That's what we're made to do. And so the question isn't, are you a worshiper? It's what or who are you worshiping and how are you worshiping? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. Peter Kreeft, he's a philosopher. He says it this way. He says the opposite of Christianity is not atheism. It's idolatry. The opposite of Christianity is not atheism. It's idolatry. You see, God wants to do something new and big in your life. I believe that. Brad believes that. Our staff, we pray for that. He wants to do something new and big in my life. But if we're not willing to participate and align our lives with God, if we're not willing to eradicate our lives of the idols that we've put before God, then how are we supposed to experience the land God has for us? If we're not willing to do these things, how are we going to experience it? I don't think it's going to work where we just show up and we're like, wow, how did I get here? This is cool, God. You did something pretty amazing. I didn't have to do anything. You just did your work, God. I'm in this new place. I've taken the land that you had for me all of a sudden. I don't think that's how it's going to work. See, it requires something of you and I. What idols are you holding on to that are keeping you from experiencing the land God has for you? Let's continue in verse 12. All right, this is a little bit of a longer chunk. We're going to go to the end of the chapter. It says this in verse 12. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord. So this is Rahab and these two spies talking. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dwelt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother and brother and sister and all who belong to them and deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, our life for yours even to death. So they make this deal. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was built in the city wall, so she lived in the city wall. And she said to them, go into the hills, or the pursuers will encounter you, and hide there for 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Then afterward you may go your way. The men said to her, we will be guiltless with respect to this oath of yours that you have made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, you shall tie this scarlet cord in the window. This is why Joshua 2 is most commonly known for right here, this scarlet cord. We will tie the scarlet cord in your window through which you let us down, and you shall gather into your house your father and mother and your brother and all your father's household. Then if anyone goes out of the door of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we shall be guiltless. But if a hand is laid on anyone who is within your house, his blood shall be on our head. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be guiltless with respect to your oath that you have made us swear. And she said, according to the word, so be it. Then she sent them away, and they departed. And she tied the scarlet cord in the window. They departed and went into the hills and remained there for 3 days until the pursuers returned. And the pursuers searched all along the way and found nothing. Then the men returned. They came down from the hills, passed over, and came to Joshua the son of Nun. And they told him all that had happened to them. And they said to Joshua, truly, the Lord has given us this land given this land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. By putting this scarlet cord in the window of her house, the spies assure Rahab that this is what's going to keep her safe. Her and her family are going to be safe because she puts this scarlet cord up. The cord becomes Rahab's identification as one to be saved. So she hangs it in her window. And in the day of calamity that's going to happen in Joshua 3 that we'll see next week, this scarlet cord hanging in Rahab's window is the thing that keeps her alive. And by placing that cord in her window, Rahab is acting out her newfound faith in God. You see, faith is not just what we believe internally, but faith is how we behave externally, right? Let me illustrate it this way. Despite what Brad may have said about me last week when it comes to teaching my kids how to swim, right? He rolled me, if you were here, right under the bus, right? Felt it, bop, bop, got me. He threw me under the bus because he said I just throw my kids in the pool and I watch them sink, basically. And then he made himself sound like an all-star, like, oh, I do these things and, did all this stuff. Well, I'm embarrassed to tell you guys, I did all this stuff. So I want to use a similar illustration with a different meaning, okay? And just for the record, too, he stands up here and he tells you, like, hey, I used to be a swimmer. He chose to wear a Speedo at a time in his life, so watch out, okay? Be careful. Little weird. It was a choice he made. Okay, Sherry, I'm sorry. I want to use a similar illustration, okay? This last summer, it's going to go a different direction. This last summer, I was teaching my boys how to swim. And my oldest son, he knows how to swim, but I was teaching my youngest how to swim. And I would be in the pool, and I'd be like, hey, buddy, just jump to me. And he'd be like, no. And I'd be like, no, you can trust Dad, jump to me. And he's like, no, I'm scared. Meanwhile, my oldest son, he's like jumping in. Dad, watch this. Yeah, whatever, doing his thing. And so I would get in this conversation with my youngest son, Banks. Buddy, just jump. It's okay. You can trust me. No, Dad, I'm not jumping. I'll die. No, you won't die, buddy. Just jump. I'll catch you. Do you trust me? No. Buddy, this is going to be okay. And I realized in this moment that I raised a small attorney because everything was like this big debate, right? And it'd just go back and forth. Trust me. No, Dad, I'm not going to do it. If I get hurt, I'm going to sue you. Like, that's just where it went. And finally we hit this point, I'm like, buddy, you can trust me. Do you trust Dad? No. You can do this. Do you trust me? If my son Banks never jumps, now you're wondering if he did. If he never jumps, does he trust me? Because no matter what we say, trust results in action. No matter what we say, trust results in action. Until Banks jumps, his faith is not in me and my ability to catch him and keep him alive. His faith is in his footing on the edge of the pool. Rahab, as she hangs that scarlet cord in the window, her trust in God is evidenced in that moment. It's no longer something that was internal. It became this external thing, a behavior. And here's this woman that was condemned by the law of Moses. The ink hadn't even dried on the law, right? Or the dust hadn't come off the tablet yet. Whatever. The law was brand new. And the law said that someone like Rahab was an outsider, an outcast. She was in direct opposition of God, that there was no place for her. Yet God, in the midst of this, Jesus in the midst of this says, my grace is sufficient. My mercy is broader than my judgment. This was a time in life where the law was a big deal. And if you didn't follow the law and obtained the law, then you were going to be in a lot of trouble. You were going to have a big problem. And in the midst of this law that is so new, God, the same person who created this law, says, my grace, my love, my mercy are sufficient. They're large enough, they're broad enough to not only save you, Rahab, and this is where this story gets kind of cool to me, that God doesn't only save Rahab because of his love, mercy, and grace, but he included Rahab in the lineage of Jesus. Rahab, this prostitute, is included, if you look back, in the lineage of Jesus. How can that be? Anyone here like to look up your family history? Like that's really, like you do that. Like I like digging into my family history. There's a couple people, right? You like looking into it and seeing who like, oh look, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma was a Cherokee princess. Cool. Well, congratulations. You know, like what does that even mean? I don't know. You got a little Cherokee princess apparently. But people like to do that. We like to look into our family history. My mom loves to look into family history. That's what she does. She likes to look into it and see all these things and tell me all this irrelevant information to my life. At least that's how it feels. And she brings over these stacks of paper and she sits them on my table and she wants to walk me through them. And I'm like, Mom, you're sucking the life out of my brain. There's not that much space and you're filling it with no good things. And so she likes to do this. Mom, if you watch this online, I love you. You're a saint. Okay, just in case. But she would do this. This is the same reason most of us, we don't like to look into our family history, right? Like maybe a couple generations back is interesting to us, but when it get too far, it's like, this doesn't really matter. This is the same reason that you and I, when we come to Matthew chapter 1 in the genealogy of Jesus, we look at it and go, okay, let's move to chapter 2, right? How many of you do that? How many of you skip over Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus? You guys are liars. I know. I do it. We come to Matthew chapter 1 and we just go, man, that's a lot of names that are irrelevant to me. And we skip over it. But I want to connect a couple of quick dots, and we're going to be finishing up in just a moment. A couple of dots about Rahab in the lineage of Jesus and what this means, okay? And so I'm going to read it. You don't have to go there. Matthew 1 through 6. It says this. It says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. That's a mean name right there. I'm Ram. And Ram the father of Abinadab, and Abinadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. And Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And right there in the lineage of Jesus, we see this prostitute Rahab. Cool. What does that mean? What does this mean for us? What this means for you and I is that God doesn't care what you've done. God doesn't care what your past looks like. God doesn't care the life that you've lived up to this point. Because the grace of Jesus is far bigger than anything you've done. He looks at a person like Rahab, who was in direct opposition, who based on everything, she was an outsider. She didn't belong to be a Christian, let alone per se, based on the law there at this time, let alone included in the lineage of Jesus. And here we are, and we see that God is a redeemer. And that this female, this woman who everybody said, you don't have a place, you're an outcast, you're an outsider, God says, come on in. You see, our God's a redeemer. And Rahab is included in the lineage of Jesus like men like King David. In the Gospels, it's good news, it's not good advice, right? Therefore, it's about what God has done for us. And what that means is that not even the greatest in this room, not even the greatest person does not need the grace of Jesus. And not even the worst, not even the lowliest person cannot receive the grace of Jesus. Because in Jesus and only in Jesus do we see a prostitute and a king seen as equals. Male and female, Jew and Gentile, moral and immoral. If you accept, and I don't want to assume that we have all accepted Jesus, but if you accept Jesus and you accept his grace, prostitutes and kings are seen as equal. And that's amazing. This whole thing for me, being up in front and being able to teach and lead and be a part of this church, if I'm honest, this isn't what I had for my life. I had far different plans. When I was 20 and 21, I was heading in a direction. I was going to do my thing. I had a career all planned out. My life was figured out. We talked earlier. I had it all sorted out, right? Had it all handled. And I was going to have a great career. Everything was going to be good. I would go to the church and maybe I'd serve a little bit. But there came this point in my life where God showed up. And I came to that crossroads. Remember that crossroads we started with? And I had to choose, do I trust and believe the promises of God in my life? Or am I going to go my own way? And I'll be the first to tell you that it hasn't been rainbows and unicorns, right? It hasn't been easy. It hasn't been what I had planned for my life. 2 weeks ago, I stood in Brad's office and I looked him in the face and I said, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm done. This is too much work. I'm not good enough. I'm not gifted enough. I'm not smart enough. And you know what he said to me? Buck up, buttercup. It's not what he said. I just made that up. I looked him in the face. I said, I'm not gifted enough. I'm not good enough. And he looked me in the face. He said, none of us are. None of us are. Some of you sit here this morning, you go, man, God can't use me. Not good enough. None of us are. But God has plans, and God has land, and God has things that he wants to do in your life. And until we begin to not allow our past to dictate our future, until we understand that what's happened, what we've been, who we were, doesn't define who we are in Jesus, until we begin to align our lives with God and eradicate the idols of our life, we don't get to experience everything God had for us. And so my prayer this morning is that we would be people that get to experience everything God has for us. Something we've been saying in this series is God has land he wants you to take. God has plans for you. There are people, I know for sure, there are people in your life who are going to experience a better future, who are going to experience Jesus, who are going to experience a life they could never dream of for themselves because of what Jesus is doing in you. But you have to let God work. Amen? Will you pray with me? Jesus, I am incredibly grateful for stories like this one in Joshua chapter 2, where I find comfort in the fact, God, that you use ordinary, unlikely people, Jesus. God, thank you for this reminder. God, thank you that there aren't a handful of prerequisites that we have to come and experience your goodness. You say, just come and be a part and experience my grace and my love and the plans I have for you. God, I pray for myself. I pray for my friends here this morning that we would be people, Lord, who don't allow what we've seen, what we've been told, what we've experienced, the lies we've believed, Lord, to dictate what we can be in you, Jesus. I pray that we would be new people, that we would be people with purpose and people who are excited to go out and live and fulfill your plans, Jesus. God, thank you. Thank you for your word and the encouragement it is, Jesus. We love you, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. Will you stand with me? I think the challenge is there, right? We know the challenge. Let's go out and let's let God work through the ordinary and the unlikely this week. Amen? All right. That's it, man. You guys have a great week. Thanks for coming. Love you guys.